Thank you.
Thank you. Well, welcome everyone. So today I'm going to talk to you all and hopefully in conversation with as well about inclusive communication. And it is something that CIPR as a whole are focusing on as well. So we're having conversation about what does that look like from a CIPR perspective and volunteer perspective. So we're all aligned with the languages that we use and what that looks like. But in order for us to kind of do that and get there, I think it's important that we understand what is inclusive communication and why is it an important part of some of the work that we do as communication professionals, whether you're external, internal, or a mixture of both, or your agency or in-house. It doesn't really matter. It's just trying to figure out what part do I play in this and how do I become an advocate in the work that I am doing so we can learn from each other in some of this stuff. So the presentation today is I'm going to talk through various steps. So I'm going to build on what we need to be aware of, do some definition, demystifying as well, and then go into some practicalities of what inclusive language actually is. And as Hayley said, feel free to ask questions in the chat. I am also very comfortable with being interrupted, by the way, it doesn't bother me. So if you want to use your hand raiser thing while I'm talking if something isn't clear, then feel free to do that, by the way. I'm happy to stop and answer any questions that you might have. With anything with stuff like this, so some of you will be far in your knowledge in this and you would have done lots of work and probably done some courses and training and all that. And some of you are right at the start of this probably. And what I always say to folks is that there's no such thing as a silly or stupid question. If you're thinking about it, then the likelihood is that there'll be people in the room that are also thinking about it. So please ask it, because I think it's really important that you have some clarification and understanding about what this looks like and what this means for you as a professional in this space, but also in terms of the education you might do to others around you. So whether your teams, your volunteering groups, or the members that you might talk to on a regular basis. So please don't worry about that. And if you do want to do it separately, so just use the DM function on the chat and just DM me separately, and I'll do it as an anonymous question as well if you don't want to ask it out loud. Because one of the things that stops people from learning is that fear, the fear of either looking silly or the fear of someone maybe accusing you of being unfair, or a fear of kind of not wanting to harm or hurt anyone else. And that's not helpful when we're learning. So I just want us to kind of make sure we contract that this is, as much as it possibly can be, a safe space for all of you to learn, and any question that you have is more than welcome as well. Is that okay with everybody? We're all good? But right, I am going to share my screen. So let me put this down. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Brilliant, thank you, John. So, as I said, I always kind of like to start off with a bit of a quote. And obviously, I'm going to use the quote that I put in my book in there, what is inclusive communication? So Priya and I, those of you who don't know, Priya Bates is my co-author for Building a Culture of Inclusivity, which is a book that we published that came out in June last year. And we wrote the book because we recognised that there was a little bit of a challenge for communication professionals to recognise what part they played when it came to equity, diversity, inclusion and belonging. And there wasn't really a clear definition about what inclusive internal communication was, but this definition would work internally and externally in our opinions. So what we said is that inclusive internal communication enables powerful connections, demonstrates curiosity, cultivates belonging through two-way engagement. The results in trusted, clear and effective communication, allowing people to thrive in their work and impact organisational performance. So everything that we do when it comes to communications, whether that's internally and externally, it's about bringing those powerful connections. It's about making sure that people understand what we're trying to do and they have a sense of belonging. And the big part is that trust. Do they trust what we're saying? Do they feel that they play a part in that? Do they understand what their value is? So hopefully that gives everyone a bit of an understanding of where we believe inclusive internal comms is. Some of you may have a different definition, but it's a starting point. And I always like to demystify what some of these acronyms mean. And there's a great quote by Werner Myers that some of you would have heard. And there's also a great analogy by Daniel Jedi. I basically married the two. And I've said that diversity is being on the guest list. Equality is making sure that everyone is invited. Equity is having access to the right transport to bring you to this party. Inclusion is being asked to choose the music for the party, and belonging is being a member of the planning committee. Does that make sense to everyone? Does that allow you to understand, especially around equality and equity? I often get into many debates around the two, because equality demonstrates fairness and equity demonstrates actually fairness is fine, but if people are starting on a different playing field, then it doesn't quite work. So what I always say to folks, and if you use it as a work context, is that if you're an organisation and you're saying to all your employees, you've got access to this training, everybody has access to this training, no one doesn't have access to it. So if you want to get training in XYZ, you've all got access to it. Equity is recognizing that some people may not be able to read on screen. Some people may not be able to access the internet to do online training. Some people learn better in a face-to-face environment. So it's making those small adjustments to make sure that you're creating the fairness that's required. I'm a quote queen. I love a quote, and so you'll see quotes throughout my talk today. So Robin Sharma says, words can inspire and words can destroy. Choose yours well. And this is something that I always have like in front of mind for me when I'm writing any content or if I'm having a conversation with somebody. I'm being quite mindful of some of the words that I use when I'm doing some communication and acknowledging that is, I will get things wrong and I will say something that's incorrect, but recognizing that I need to be aware of that and learn, apologize and move on. And that's why words change frequently. We're all in the word game, 25 years ago, Google didn't exist, and yet it's part of our vocabulary. Same with ChatGPT, 4 years ago, 3 years ago, that didn't even exist, and yet we use it. So words do change, and this is acknowledging how they can impact the way we communicate as individuals. So step one is understanding trust. So when we wrote our book, we realized from the research we've done and the clients that we work with and the organization that we supported, where things went wrong quite quickly is when trust wasn't present and when people didn't trust what their leaders were saying or doing. So we realized if you want to build a culture of inclusion with inclusivity as core part of what you're doing and use words and language and inclusive language to do this, you need to understand what trust means and what that looks like. So this is from Edelman a couple of years ago, well last year actually, the Trust Barometer, and Edelman do a trust survey thing every year, and if you haven't read it then I highly recommend that you look into it. It's full of it's controversy around it. Some people have got issues with it, some people haven't, but generally it gives you an understanding of what's going on in the world globally. So they survey like over 100,000 people and they use that information to kind of base where the world is right now. In 2023 they said we're in a polarized world, we're navigating a polarized world, and I still think even in 2024 we're there. And when we are in this space where the world isn't where we need it to be, following on the aftermath of COVID and the pandemic, the horrificness we're seeing in certain countries right now with the wars and the genocides and all the kind of evoking emotive words that people are using to describe the challenges that individuals are facing, there's a economic anxiety, as you can imagine, right? So your employees, your customers, all those folks are split with their emotions and where they are right now, which is causing some mistrust and distrust in the information that's been presented to them. Alongside this kind of institutional imbalance as well. So businesses are now seen as the only institutes that are competent and ethical. So a lot of your colleagues and your customers to an extent will be leaning into your business leaders to guide them, because the trust in the government, even with the new government, and especially with the latest stuff that's coming out, is not quite there. Trust in things like the police and those kind of organizations that are supposed to keep us safe is not there. So now leaders are kind of media, we all know some of the challenges that are facing the media are not there, and we've got access to things like social medias and stuff like that where there's lots of misinformation, disinformation. So a lot of folks are now looking at their leaders for leading them, guiding them, giving them the sense of comfort and certainty. Alongside of the leaders are now having to suddenly have a bit of a voice in areas that they probably wouldn't have got involved in, this is kind of mass class divide. So people are saying that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, and the middle class is kind of getting split. There's no real such thing as middle class anymore. And research is kind of showing that there's more food banks than we've ever had before, and there's still lots of challenges in people living the way they're supposed to live, especially in countries like ours, where no one should really be homeless and no one should really be struggling for food, and people should be able to have fairness when it comes to accessing healthcare. So there is a big divide in what the top quartile think is going on in the world and what the rest of the world thinks. So you're going to face conflict in the workplace. You're going to face confrontation, and it's why that gap is widening with remote and hybrid working, because connection is not it's not there as much. And so I can see the argument on the other side of bringing people back together in the office to potentially build that connection if it's done in the right way. There are debates and challenges when it's not done in the right way. It can cause more disconnection. And then this kind of battle for the truth, which I've spoken about. So the media environment right now is challenging with all sorts of misinformation, disinformation, and the relationship between journalists and PR and all of that kind of stuff still needs work, which means that there's more ownership now and leadership from the business perspective as well. And they've got a more recent report out, which is similar themes, but it kind of gives you an understanding why trust is a key part of some of the work that we're doing. I always like to refer to the trust equation as to give people an understanding about what trust is, because we often lean quite heavily on one area of trust, which is credibility. Now, credibility is really important, and we all have to be credible in the work that we're doing in order for people to trust the deliverables that we are, have been given. So your words and how believable you are, right? So that's your kind of credibility. Reliability and intimacy, though, plays a big part in your trustworthiness. The trust equation has been developed by the trusted advisors, and I'll share the links and the resources if anyone's interested. So what they say, alongside credibility, in order to build trust, you need to be reliable. So your actions and how people can depend on you is a big part of trust. Alongside intimacy or / relationship building. So your emotions and how safe people feel sharing information with you. So alongside this, your words and how believable you are, and then how your actions and how people can depend on you, you need to be able to create a space where people feel safe in sharing information with you. And that is a combination of what trustworthiness looks like for an individual, either those who are building trust or those who are giving trust. So it works that way. What they do say, however, is that if your motives and how you focus on others rather than yourself is in the negative space, then people are going to see through that. And if you're doing it for selfish reasons in order to build trust, so you're doing it as a form of manipulation, or you're doing it to kind of pull the wool over someone's eyes, really, if they see through that or you get found out, then that trust is going to get depleted and it's going to take forever to rebuild it again. And I always say to the leaders I work with and colleagues that I support is that if they don't trust you, they don't hear you. And that's really important to understand where you are when it comes to trust as a leader in your own right in the organizations that you support. Why are people not listening to you? What is happening in terms of some of the conversations you're having? And where do you think you may need to build your credibility? Is it reliability? Is it your relationship building? Because it'll be one of them three that you may have a gap. Some will peak more than others. So in some instances, you may have to show more reliability, and in other instances, you may have to show more relationship building. But it's being self-aware enough to know where you are. Because when it comes to talking about inclusive language and inclusion, as a communication professional, you need people to be able to trust you so they know you're guiding them in the right way. The second step is understanding how inclusive you are. And we've developed this 6-step model in terms of understanding where you believe you are when it comes to inclusive cultures, and where all your peers may think you are. And we've got a free assessment, and you're free to take it, it's completely up to you. But what we say is that there's 6 clear steps. There's exist, which is about we're comfortable where we are and there's no real need for change. There's enter, so you're kind of dipping your toes into it. So you may do some of these, what's classed as performative, maybe even tokenistic action. So when the murder of George Floyd, a load of folks put black squares on Instagram, not really knowing why they were doing that. You may put a rainbow flag in your window at work to demonstrate that you are embracing LGBTQ plus community. You may share some stories about women in leadership on International Women's Day. But really, when you look behind these kind of actions that you're doing, where has the real results happened? Are there more women in leadership? Because you're saying that you care about women leadership, but in your organisation, are you seeing that change and shift? Are you seeing gender equality? Is there a gender pay gap? That kind of stuff. If you are recognising that LGBTQ plus community are welcome in your workplace, then have you checked that your CEO isn't donating to a far right group that believes that gay marriages should be illegal? You know, and those are the things that people do discover afterwards. So that's where the performative action comes in. You may be in education, which is about reading those books, watching those programs, getting that training. So your organisation may have put you through unconscious bias training. You may have listened to workshops like this, you know, someone like me talking about it. You may have listened to a podcast. You might have bought our book. You may be in that education space. And what we find in this research and the assessments that have been taken so far, that most folks tend to fall here in the education or embrace. So embrace is where you understand the case, the business case for doing this kind of work. You've got that DEI lead, or you've got someone who is responsible for it in your organisation, and you've got a bit of a plan. So you recognise that you know, this is the direction we want to go in. Engage is when you realise that this isn't just down to that EDI professional, it's actually something that should be everyone's responsibility and everyone takes ownership and accountability for it. People feel comfortable in speaking up, there's psychological safe environment around there. Nobody fears saying something if it's not right. And employees get it, it's part of their DNA. It's not a standalone pillar in a strategy, it's part of everyone's work and it's completely embedded in. Which then will lead to that final stage, which is, this is just how we do things around here. It's like we don't need a plan, we don't really need a strategy, it's just everyday work. You know, when you come into this workplace, everyone's included, everyone belongs, everyone has their way of working. It's a part of the employee and customer life cycle, and that's when that inclusive culture is formed. We rarely see anyone in embed, to be fair, like out of the last 12 months we've had this assessment out, we're probably 1% are in embed. Majority sit in the middle, educate and embrace. And then there's second layer is like exist and enter. And it's different in different locations, as you can imagine. Any questions on the DEI evolution and the steps? Are we all good? Okay. Step 3 is about biases. So before you can kind of go into the workplace and talk about inclusive language and what does that mean for us, you need to recognise where the biases might be. So Daniel Kahneman is somebody who has written, is a great, I mean, sadly passed away earlier this year, but he wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. And if you like to read, then I highly recommend that you grab a hold of a copy of this book. And if you have read it, you'll know what I mean when I talk about these two things. So Daniel Kahneman says and shares that through his research and his experience, people generally have two sides of a brain. These are not scientific terms, by the way. These are Daniel Kahneman's terms, but he describes it as system 1 brain and system 2 brain. So in our system 1 brain, we spend around 95% of our time. So we're quick to make decisions. We unconsciously sometimes make these decisions. We rely on our gut feelings and we're quite automatic. Because we're in this automatic phase, we can make a lot of mistakes and errors because we're moving at pace. And as communication professionals, we're normally spinning 347 million plates. And we've got a to-do list as long as our arm, and we're short on resources and budget. So we're doing a lot. So we're working very quickly, generally. When we're in this phase is where, like I said, you make those mistakes and you say things that may be incorrect. You may put content out that isn't inclusive. You may tell your leaders something that isn't right, because we haven't allowed that time to slow down. When it comes to inclusivity and making sure that you're using the right words and language, you have to be really conscious, especially as you're learning. And if you're in the educate phase, you have to slow your brain down a bit. And this is where your system 2 kicks in. So slowing down, making those conscious decisions and making rational decisions takes a bit of time and energy, and you almost have to kind of feed it into your diary. So if you're doing a big piece around International Women's Day, rather than kind of rushing it through, it's important to kind of take a step back and go, right, what is it that we're trying to achieve from this day? What are we trying to do, and where are we kind of helping our colleagues learn more about the systemic biases facing women in the workplace? And that's when we start getting things a bit right, because we're leaning into our curiosity a little bit more. When we are constantly in system one and don't give ourselves time in system two, is when we make those mistakes and fear sets in, and then we step back and we don't do anything. We don't ask those questions. We don't allow ourselves to have reflective moments. We assume and make assumptions quite quickly about things, and people stop talking about it. And that's something that a lot of your leaders may experience, some of your customer base, even if you're working in a service-led industry, may face as well. And this is where we come in as communication professionals to kind of give that confidence to leaders about what they can and should say, and making sure that they're in tune with their biases as well. I'm not going to go through all these because some of you will be fully aware, and I'll share these with Maha to send out to the group. But these are some of the common communication biases that are out there. The ones I kind of want to pick on is confirmation bias. So confirmation bias is when we seek out and use information that confirms our view and expectations. In other words, we cherry-pick the information to validate our points. The reason I say this one is because when we are under pressure and we're trying to prove our worth and we don't feel that we're being valued in an organisation, to prove our value and our point, we may go out and just pick the things that makes us feel good at times. And it's a different conversation, but this is why we struggle sometimes with measurement, and we struggle to put metrics against things because it kind of holds a torch up to some of the things that we may be contributing to. So when we're asked to kind of give feedback, we may just pick the things that we believe the leaders want to hear. And that's kind of where the confirmation bias comes in, and we can take the organisation in a completely different route, really. The same applies in the membership, right? The volunteering work that you do, that when you hear feedback from your members, you might just cherry pick unconsciously at times because you want to feel good. Who doesn't want to feel good? And so we just have to be aware that we're surrounding ourselves with different thoughts as well. And people, if people question that belief, we can back it up with that we did it in the right way. The second bias I want to raise, is authority bias. So authority bias is when we tend to believe authority figures and we follow their instructions without really questioning them. And we follow them because we believe that they've got the expertise to do this in the right way, and we kind of blindly follow their decision without actually having our own critical thinking. So Matthew Syed has written a book called Rebel Ideas, and in that book he talks about where authority bias has created some pretty catastrophic situations because individuals have kind of followed a leader's authority because they've just been convinced that this is the authority figure and we can't question authority. And I know that can definitely happen in some of the work that we do, and especially when we're still trying to prove our worth in organisations. So it's important to kind of think about where you may be on some of these biases and how you may contribute to some of this. And this is why you might need to check in with your system 2 brain and allow yourself to slow down that thinking so you can make the right decisions. Any questions on the biases?
Advita, I don't know if you can see in the chat, there's a question from Abha there about some further reading.
Yes, I've got a list of reading materials, Abha, that I will send to Hayley or Maha to send out. So I've got all them. I've got a booklet actually, which I'll send over. So 10, I'm going to just skip through.
Sorry, Peter, I was just going to say I was struck with the list of confirmation biases. So I was speaking for the Crisis Communication Network. If you look at the international standards on managing crisis and you get down to strategic decision making, how many of these, maybe not using the same terminology, but how many of these are there as hindering good decision making during a crisis? It's really interesting to see the cross over there.
Well, there's a lot, Chris, and you would have seen that, right? And when you're in crisis and you're making decisions so quickly, it's so easy to lean into your biases because it's just quick and you're in your system 1 brain, and you can't really afford in a crisis to be like, oh, let's just pause for a second and let's just reflect. Like, none of that, which is why lessons learned is so critical. after a crisis and you put that crisis plan together, right? We talk about that a lot, that if an organisation doesn't have a crisis plan, then you're setting yourself up to fail quite quickly. And you need to keep doing those lessons learned and check-ins. And also why it's so important to have a team around you that is representative of the work that you're doing, but also in terms of diversity of thought as well. Because we do sometimes negate that sometimes for representation, and representation is important 100%, and that often brings diversity of thought. But we've seen in our politicians that it doesn't necessarily mean just because you've got a different skin color you're going to have a different way of thinking. You still need to look at the educational side of things. You still need to look at the environment and the socioeconomic backgrounds to make sure that you're covering all angles of the thought process as well. So just to your point, 100% that in crisis, yes, you'll be in system one a lot because you're making decisions very quickly and you will make mistakes, and that's a given. But it's what you do afterwards and how you make sure that those mistakes don't happen again, so you can avoid catastrophes. It's like the example I'll give actually is Bin Laden, right? So when Bin Laden first came out into this world as this, you know, he actually was in a cave wearing what seemed like ragged clothes, right? He had like this ragged clothes, ripped and looking a bit unclean and a little bit disillusioned with stuff. When the FBI, whoever the American folks were that saw it, dismissed it and said he's a bloke who's obviously lost the plot, is looks homeless, like what on earth is he going to do? What they didn't realise is because they didn't have anyone that understood the culture, the Muslim culture and Islam specifically, they didn't realise that that's actually his way of going into war, and that's his stand and making that stand. And their bias created this absolute chaos that came from Bin Laden sharing that video, and they learned a lot from that. And now I would hope they've got contingencies in place that would never happen again, and they've got, you know, diversity of thought and got representative diversity that understands that cultural side that is often missed. And Matthew Said in that book that I mentioned has shared a load of examples where crisis has happened catastrophically at times because biases have not been called out.
Yeah.
No, really, really fair point there, Chris.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, then in terms of how we can address this, so we've just said a little bit there when I went through it. I'm just going to open them all up. So exploring those kind of lived experiences and unlearning behaviours can take a bit of time. So recognise what that is, what you're doing and how you're contributing to some of that. And it's a hard piece of work, by the way. And it exposes you in ways that's quite vulnerable. So what you may end up doing is retreating because you're worried about what this means for you. Because when you start looking at contributions that you may have made to certain conversations, you might go, oh, sugar, am I homophobic? Like, because I thought this. Am I sexist? Because I believe this. And learning some of that stuff does take a bit of time. And I will always say to folks, find that safe space for you, you know, follow people that you wouldn't normally follow. As much as, you know, as much as it can be sometimes uncomfortable, following someone with an opposite view for you is quite useful because you get to learn from both sides and you're not in an echo chamber or information bubble. You know, you kind of you can disagree with them, but it's really important to know what other sides and other opinions are saying, because some of it you may change your mind and some of it you'll learn differently. So again, interacting with people who are not in community, slowing down that decision making. So putting in, when you're doing work around inclusion, putting those reflective moments in and doing those lessons learned that I just said to Chris about. Ask for options and thoughts from other people. So if you look around your table, especially communication professionals, right, we know we're not as diverse as we possibly could be. So when you're looking around that table or virtual table or real table and you don't see the representation that you may need to see in terms of the people that you're working with, then go and find other opinions and speak to different people or invite people in and have those chats. Learn the terminologies, you know, understand things like intersectionality. What does that mean? You know, those of you who don't know, intersectionality means that it's a phrase that was coined by Professor Kimberly Crenshaw in the late 80s when she recognised that people were put in singular boxes. So that's a black person, that's somebody who's gay, that's somebody who's a woman, and not really thinking about the cross intersectionalities of what makes a human being. And what she saw that black women specifically face greater discrimination than women, and the intersectionality of what made them a black woman was facing a lot of unfairness in the workplace, and it all came to fruition when some Black women took the workplace forward actually was to court because they were being discriminated with, and Ford won because they'd actually, we're not discriminating against them because this is our equality policy on women, but they didn't consider race in that. So that's where intersectionality came in. Considering your own privileges, in our book, we talk about the privilege pyramid, but there's also the privilege wheel. You know, we talk a lot about white privilege, but it's more than that. It's also about the privileges that we all have. You know, my own privileges, I'm educated background, I have a safe home. I don't need to worry too much about dependence and financial safety. That plays a part in how I show up. So we need to understand what our own privileges are and why some people may say certain things and some people may not. Think about the topics that you avoid talking about and why you might avoid talking about them. Do you listen more than you talk? Put yourself in place of other people and understand what they're thinking and what you have to do next to increase your awareness and accountability, and do an action plan around it, because once you break down, you know, you kind of have to follow that. Step 4 is about auditing your communications from a professional point of view. So Rita Mae Brown says language is a roadmap of culture. It tells you where people come from and where they are going. And this is why I'm a passionate person about when it comes to language. And when I went to see Brené Brown, those of you who don't know Brené Brown, she's an academic who writes a lot about human behaviours and psychology, and she talks a lot about vulnerability. So I flew to Amsterdam last Friday and I went to see her talk, and she said, when you want to see a culture shift, people look at the outcome of culture shifting, but in fact, it's language first. So when you change the language in the organisation, it then has a knock-on effect on performance, which then has an effect on culture. So it's always about the language and the words that are being used to communicate in the workplace. Once you adjust and adapt that language, you'll see an impact on the performance, because that's a measurable element that people lean on quite a lot. Then you'll see the culture shift. But we don't give as much attention to the words that we use in the workplace. And that's really important when we want to see a shift in behaviours. So language that avoids the use of certain expressions or words that might be considered to exclude particular groups of people. For example, gender-specific words such as man or mankind, and masculine pronouns, the use of which might be considered to exclude women, is what we mean when we talk about inclusive language. These are some questions for you to think about. Are you promoting one leader more than others in an organisation? Are your images representative of the workforce? Who do you lean to for information? Do you have a team that's representative of the public that you serve, or the organisation that you're supporting? How are you educating yourself? What's your engagement data telling you? And people always say to me, oh, our employee engagement data, we scored 76%, it's brilliant. We're doing so well with engagement. And I will always say, what's the demographics of that data? Because if you, and rightly so, you'll have a more dominant culture, which is, you know, it's expected. But what are your minority folks telling you? And does it align with the overarching general consensus that you've got great engagement? Because in my experience, when you break down the demographics and you look at the demographics and put it against the engagement score, those who are minorities are underrepresented, and women have a lower engagement score. And what we often do as communication professionals is that we sometimes don't get involved in the data as much as we should do, and we take it as a given that the engagement score in this organisation is 76% and we're all doing really well. And we've got a few things that we need to fix, but we're doing well. But when you go deeper and you start looking, and this is why I'm passionate about collecting demographic data, it tells you where the challenges are. And often, I would say 90% of the time, the correlation between the good engagement score that you've seen does not relate to the experiences of your marginalised, minority, ethnic, underrepresented individuals. And that's where we kind of start, the trouble starts really, because we make assumptions that everything is going really well, and then things start falling apart, and that's when crisis kind of comes in. So we've got a question. Oh, John's just saying he's got to go. Okay, no worries, John. Fine. Any questions on the inclusiveness? On how inclusive you are? I'll share a story with you actually before I move on to the next one. I was brought in to support an organisation that was really struggling to get stories from underrepresented individuals. So the head of comms asked me to have a chat with her. So we got on a call and she goes, you know, we do quite well. Like she shared her engagement scores with me. You know, she said, we do really well, performance is good, but we really struggle to hear from our underrepresented colleagues. And they worked with an organisation where 30% of their workforce were underrepresented. And she goes, it's just, I don't understand why, and you know, we're really struggling with it. And actually, she did the deep dive on her engagement survey, which showed that people felt excluded who were from an ethnic minority specifically. And as she was talking, behind her, she had frames on her wall with front covers of her magazine, her in-house magazine that they still printed because it was a workforce that had people not online, so quite remote. And she had 12 on the wall behind her, the ones I could see anyway above her head. Every single one was one type of demographic. So I said to her, I said, oh, are those your staff magazines? And she was really proud. She goes, oh yeah, we love it. Our colleagues love it. It's amazing. We think it's brilliant. And I said, oh, have you noticed a pattern on your front covers? And she was like, oh, and she turned around and she looked and she was like, yeah, oh yeah, no, not really. Like we've got all ages, you know, we've got representation. And I said, you haven't got all different ages. I said, they're all probably aged between 35 and 55. I said, and majority are actually all women, and they're all white women, and they're all of a certain position, right? Like this authority position. I said, and a lot of people probably don't relate to that. And she was mortified. She didn't see it. She hadn't seen that her front covers were actually all not representative of the workforce, right? So you would expect, if you were going to be quite metric with it, that 30% of those front covers would be of somebody from an ethnic minority background, but there wasn't, it wasn't a malicious thing at all. It was because her team were, you know, just going to the people that had their biases, the people who were saying, yeah, I'll do it. And so her front covers just ended up being the same type of people. Those things make a big difference in an organisation when it comes to belonging. It's the unspoken word as much as the spoken word that can make a difference to people in terms of belonging. It's that leader who may shout the loudest, who seems to be a dominant character, who may get more stories in the staff, in the colleague or staff or employee newsletter or an intranet story, because they are more bolder and shoutier. And if you look at if you do the breakdown of how many stories you're sharing from different people, then there'll be a pattern, I guarantee it. Basic principles of belonging is removing that jargon from your copy. Don't use words like dumb it down. I don't think we do that anymore anyway, but I still hear it occasionally. It's more about accessibility. It's like, is this understandable to the folks that we are communicating with? Paying attention to the language that you use as well. Is it inclusive? Are your channels inclusive? You know, you need to think about visual impairments, such as, you know, audio descriptions, learning disabilities, literacy difficulties, hearing, coordination difficulties. Consider all of this. I still see videos that don't have captioning, you know, and I still see images being shared on social media platforms without alt text. Those things make a big difference, and it may seem like it's a bit of a hindrance, but there's now tools available to do it quickly, where you can upload an image and it'll give you the alt text quite quickly. Every single image that you're sharing on your organizational platform should have an alt text description, without even any kind of discussion around it, because there are many people who use screenwriters, even people whose English is their second language will sometimes use it as a descriptor, as an audio thing. So just be mindful of, if you don't do that, then that's one quick fix you can do quite quickly. When you're changing your mindset, don't be afraid to be called out. Make sure that you're expanding your community. Look inside your organisation for support and help as well. Understand that change can take a little bit of time. We are living in a world of immediacy, right? So we read a book, we might watch a podcast, or listen to a podcast, sorry, you might watch a YouTube video. Then we just expect to be really knowledgeable in this space, and that's not the case. Like, it takes time and it takes a bit of energy and it takes a bit of effort. And we sometimes give ourselves a hard time if we don't know something, and we blame ourselves. And when we start blaming ourselves, we start feeling the shame. And when we feel the shame, it stops us being curious. And when we stop being curious, we can't make change happen. So accept the fact that you will fail. It's not when, it's not if, sorry, it's when, because you will. You will get things wrong. You may say something that's not right. I get called out on it as well, and I work in this space, and accepting it, understanding it, learning it, and adapting. Like, it's so important that we give ourselves grace when we're learning, and not getting defensive. If somebody is not happy about the way you've addressed them, then don't get defensive and say, well, that's what Advita told me on a call that I was with. Like, that's what we should be. It's like, well, how, you know, please explain more, tell me more. And using their experiences as well, and acknowledging that, you know, people are different, and that's okay. Some of the conflicts that you might face, people may not care, it's too hard. You'll see, it's too hard to do this. Fear of making mistakes that I've spoken about, and this word woke, which I absolutely hate as a weapon. It's all woke nonsense. And it's been actually taken away from the Black community, to be honest. And it's just, and it doesn't help that some of our right-wing influencers use this word as a weapon all of the time. And to be fair, I'm proud to be woke. You know, it means that I am leaving the world, I hope, in a better place. And if it means calling out unfairness and discrimination, then fine, whatever. You know, call it what you like, but this is what you may face as professionals when you're trying to push things in your organization, that some leaders may be resistant to it because they haven't done the learning behind it. And an example I'll share with you is the Disney and Budweiser. So I don't know if anyone saw this, but Disney and Budweiser, around similar times actually, were absolutely faced a media storm. So Disney, because they let down the LGBTQ plus community because of the Florida gay rights stuff that was going on around a couple of years ago, and Budweiser because of their lack of support when they used a trans person in one of their campaigns, a trans woman. So Disney CEO responded in a way, so there's a media storm, the share prices were all over the place, people were attacking them left, right and centre. Disney accepted it and said, we made a mistake. We shouldn't have done that. We apologise. You know, you've helped me understand. They were humble and they took it on board and they learned from the experiences. Budweiser CEO, or I can never pronounce that name, but the Budweiser CEO, they doubled down and started to talk about something that's really irrelevant, and actually left the person that they should have supported, a vulnerable person, should have supported, they hung them out to dry and basically said, we're not interested, like, we shouldn't have done it, shouldn't have got involved in this, I'm stepping away, that's it. And what you had seen in the kind of stock prices and the share prices and the sentiments is that Disney actually went high again and they started to, you know, get the support. And this company, I think they're just about coming into recovery mode, but it did not do them any favours at all. And that demonstrates the empathy and the sympathy and how you may come across in the public domain when your CEO is writing content. And I can guarantee that it would have been a communications professional that would have helped put some of these words together. And then the final step is step 5, which is about watching out for your pitfalls. So this is what you need to avoid when you are building a culture of inclusion. Some of this will be direct responsibility from communications professionals, and some of this will be your influence in this, whether you're PR or internal or external or mixture of both. It's not giving people an opportunity to feedback. So feedback is a big part of the work that we do, and having that safe, high trust culture helps to earn that trust from colleagues. If you're just doing one-way content and not allowing people to feedback up the channel, then people will not trust you, and they'll just be seen as you're just shoving a load of stuff down their way, not allowing them to come back and have a conversation. So if you do town halls, if you do team briefings, if you're sending out an email, make sure there's an opportunity for people to kind of comment back in some way. So make it clear. You often have to give permission. We want to hear your feedback. We want to hear what you have to say. Please let us know, reply back to this email, fill in this form. Don't assume that they can just hit reply and reply back. Some people need that instruction. Inaccurate or incorrect messaging. So like I said before, spoken about this a little bit, that if you're working at pace, you'll make mistakes. So be conscious of misinformation. You know, be conscious about what people are sharing internally and shut them down. Try and have a single source of truth as well. Rumours spread much quicker. If people don't know where to go, they'll just make stuff up, or they'll start spreading external information that isn't true. So we have to be on top of the misinformation and disinformation stuff, and we know that from what we're seeing in the industry and the trends that we're seeing as well. Irrelevant messaging as well. So sometimes when leaders don't want to take ownership, we may be persuaded or told to send something out that doesn't really address the concerns that people have raised. And we need to be quite mindful of that. And we have to pluck up the courage at times and step up to that leader and go, you sending that information out or that message out doesn't really address the concerns that people have raised. And in fact, it's going to cause more disengagement than it will help. So this is where we need to step into the kind of business shoes of that leader and say that this isn't going to be helpful. And it can come across as uncaring as well, even though the intention might be in the right place. Limited representation, I've spoken about this, you know, do you have representation around you? Do you speak to colleagues who are different? They don't necessarily have to be part of an employee resourcing group or anything like that, but look around and go and speak to those people who don't speak up, because we can sometimes lean on those who are very vocal about things as well. Assumptions, make sure that you're checking in on a bias all of the time. We make assumptions every day because we're just working at pace. If you're not certain, or you're using your own lived experiences, because you know, as a woman, I know this is what I'd want, so let's just do it. Don't do that, because we can't make that assumption. So make sure you get the collective view sometimes, especially when it's a sensitive subject that you need to communicate about. Coaching is a big part of what we do. You know, you have to coach some of the leaders to feel confident in the words that they're using to talk about some sensitive subjects that they might have to. As I said at the start, you know, trust is much more in business leaders, and business leaders are now expected to talk about some sensitive topics. So you may be asked to talk about the situation in Gaza and Israel, what's going on in Ukraine and Russia, all that stuff. It's sensitive, it's awkward, it's uncomfortable. It doesn't feel, it feels like it's going to cause a storm, but you need to make sure there's a viewpoint where you're going to go. I had a query from one of my clients who said that somebody's coming in, a few colleagues are wearing the Palestinian flags into workplaces, and we want to tell them to stop doing that. And I said, what's your policy on this? Do you have a policy on workwear, and do you have a policy on political stance? Because if you don't, it's going to be really difficult for you to have that conversation. You need to be quite mindful about how this shows up and what that means. And if you're telling people that they can't wear Palestinian flags, then are you telling other people who may be recognizing that Ukraine, are you telling them that they can't support Ukraine in that way as well? And it's whatever it is, I'm no judgment from my perspective, but you need to make sure that you're being fair and you're giving people the rationale about the why. So why we're asking you not to do that. And you have to be very clear in your policies. And that's not our job as communication professionals, but it's our job to encourage and influence the teams that might do that based on what we're hearing and what we're seeing, especially when it comes to reputation damage. So we do not want any of our colleagues going onto any of our social platforms and blowing up something that they may have misinterpreted, or somebody feels they're saying the right thing and says the wrong thing, and then we have to deal with the fallout of that. So this is why I say that comms may not be responsible for developing those policies, but comms will be responsible in protecting the reputation of what's going on. So this is why we need to influence some of the, if it's not clear where you stand on some of this political messaging, and you may never communicate it publicly, you still need to understand where your leaders are in some of this and what they're going to say, especially if they're spokespeople and they're going out, they may be asked what their viewpoints are. And then lack of action fatigue, you know, people aren't tired of talking about this topic. What they're tired about is people not taking action. And that's what is really important. So people are just fed up of performative and tokenistic gestures that don't lead to anything. And I will always use it's Black History Month right now. And if you are an organisation who's recognising Black History Month, my question to you is that what has your organisation done in the last 12 months to help Black colleagues or your Black customers feel that they're belonging, or, you know, have you seen more impact in the community? How have we supported? Because if you every year you're just churning out the same stuff and there's no traction, then my question back would be, why are we doing this? What is the purpose of this? Same with other awareness months as well. Right, I'm going to stop there before I go into practical advice, because I want to make sure that I answer any questions that might be in your minds. Any questions so far? Anything that you are uncertain about, you're uncomfortable about?
Peter, would it be possible to go back to your slide on actions to address?
Yeah.
That's possible.
Which one was it, Chris? Can you remind
It
me?
was right towards the, yeah, keep going, actions to address. I think it's before this.
Before this?
Yeah, I think so. Oh, yeah, maybe, yeah, there it is. Actions to address bias and build confidence. And I don't know what the answer is to this, but I'd be really interested in your view. Because this implies to me the need to, be very open, very broad-minded. You use the word curiosity a lot, which I think is a great word when we talk about this agenda. But I just wondered what your thought was, because I'm struck by, often I meet PR professionals who say that there are certain communication channels that they avoid because of their own personal opinions. For example, Twitter's a sewer, I never look at it. The Daily Mail's racist, I never read it. And I'm a bit worried that, whatever your personal views are we at risk, or are those people with views like that at risk of trapping themselves in their own echo agenda so they don't hear the views of other people? So kind of going against your recommendation here, we may not like what some of these channels are saying, but if we end up with a long list of channels we don't want to read or listen to or view or whatever, are we in danger as PR professionals of closing ourselves off from that need to be curious and open and broad?
Yeah, to be fair, as a very straightforward answer, yes, we are. The one disclaimer in this is that if it's causing you harm. So I don't go on Twitter anymore, X, because I don't like how it makes me feel in terms of my mental health. And there's stuff in there when the riots happened that really impacted me and triggered me. So I refuse to go on there because I just don't think it's a platform that's safe for people like me on there. That's a personal choice. However, what I do instead is I do follow people who have a very different viewpoint on equity, diversity and inclusion. And mainly to understand their perspective, whether I agree with it or disagree with it or whatever. It's important for me as somebody who works in this space to recognise what some people in organisations will be feeling, so I can address it when I'm giving advice. Because you're right, we spend a lot of our time, especially in the PR world, we do spend a lot of time in the echo chambers and information bubbles. So when the race riots happened, I was told by well-meaning individuals that it's only a small minority, you don't need to worry about it, majority are not like this. That it may be a valid point, and it might be true to an extent, but how do I know that? Now, how do I know that the person I'm going to be stood next to on the bus stop isn't thinking that they hate me and they're going to spit in my face? Like, you don't. So as helpful as they may think they are in reassuring me, I know from my own research and involvement in reading other sides of the coin that there's more people with that level of frustration and hate than we are led to believe, because we're surrounded often by people like us who get it, who understand it, who are friendly and a conversationalist, and will be like, oh, we're not like that, but actually we're not in that other space. We don't go for the drink with someone from the right wing. We don't do that kind of stuff because it doesn't align with our values. So in order for us to learn about why they may be feeling that way, sometimes we may need to go into that space. But I choose carefully. And as a woman and a woman of colour who is going to be stepping into presidency in the new year, I have to protect my space. So I will lean more into my community who are in those spaces to get updates from them, and I will follow individuals on professional platforms like LinkedIn, and I will occasionally tap into the Daily Mail and see what the headlines are to see the other side of the coin. And that's how I do my learning. But you're right, we sometimes make a stand and go, I'm not going on there, I'm deleting the entire thing and I'm protecting all this, and I'm not going to, and that's fine if it's impacting your mental health and it's impacting the way you live. I get that, and that's important, and that has to be number one in everything that we do. if you're doing it to make a stand and you're not really going into different avenues to find different viewpoints, then I would say that you're probably not helping yourself in understanding what you may need to understand about the people that you're supporting sometimes.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you. Particularly, you know, there are certain channels, and you mentioned Twitter, you know, that can have a profound adverse effect on your mental health and how you feel. I absolutely get that. I don't know, maybe there's a role for us at the CIPR about giving some advice to members in terms of, you know, still being able to give the counsel that our organisations need, and they do need the counsel that comes from that curiosity, that broad range of views, but still being able to protect ourselves in the way you describe, because it keeps coming up, that issue of Vita, and I'm thinking, oh, we really need some good, and what you've just said there about selecting some people who do have different opinions to you and actually going out and purposefully doing that, I think is really, really important, because I'm just nervous, I'm worried that lots of people are, you know, obviously I'm speaking mainly from the crisis point of view, going to find it more and more difficult to advise their organisations because they just simply don't really know what's happening.
Yeah, and this is why I'll always say to people that, you know, as communication professionals, we do need to be out and about talking to the people that we're communicating with, you know, hearing their points of view, what are they saying, what's going on, which is, you know, I will always be on this, like, yeah, I am a big advocate of hybrid working and remote working. But if you have to go where your population are.
Yeah.
And you have to go and have those conversations with those individuals. And if most of your population that you're working with are remote and not online and are on factory floors, frontline, whatever, as a communication professional, we have a care of duty to go where they are. So we can hear what they're saying and we can communicate with them so we know what we're communicating. Otherwise, it's really difficult when you're sat in your own little space, in your own little safety, and you're listening and reading stuff that you like, to have an informed viewpoint of the world that we're in today.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. As you mentioned there, the number of people and the amount of time we're spending working at home on our own. That's another really important point, I think. Thank you. Really interesting.
You're welcome. Conscious of time, so what I'm going to do next is I'm going to send Hayley, the next part of it is just basically practical. These are the words that you shouldn't really use today, and these are the words that you should probably use. Really, what I will say on that when you get the slides is do your own homework and research, because things change every day, and some people and ask that, lean into that curiosity and ask people. If people say I don't like being referred to in that way, listen to them. It's fine. I've got a friend who's got a child in a wheelchair and she calls him disabled, my disabled child, and she actually got called out by somebody who apparently is an advocate and ally, and said, you should refer to him as somebody with a disability, and actually called her out on it, which blows my mind that somebody can actually say something to someone who's living in that space already and is comfortable with her son being called disabled, and her son is comfortable with that. So that's why that's where conflict starts and confrontation starts. So just be mindful. So I'll send you that, you have that, have a look at it. And from a CIPR perspective, what I have said to the EDIC committee that I chair is that I would want to put together a volunteer pack of inclusive language that CIPR are aligning to, so we're all kind of talking the same language when we're referencing various things in our regions or committees that we're part of as well. So that's really important that we have alignment there. Like, we don't use the word BAME, right? That's just, even though it's not illegal to use the term BAME, it's being said that BAME is a reference that's no longer accepted. Some of you may or may not know that, and that's unfair if you don't have the guidance to help you. So it's kind of moving that into a one-pager just to kind of give you a guide on where CIPR on some of the terms and references that we may have when we're communicating to our members. Great. Are we on the same link, Hayley, for the group?